Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Australian Water Reform Roadshow. My name is Mark Dougal. I am the founder and managing director of Spiker. A couple of housekeeping points before we begin. Firstly, today's session is being recorded, and the recording and slide pack will be made available following this webinar. For the panel discussion, please, for any questions you might have for the panel, please post your questions in the Q&A function, and also select all panels when you are posting your questions. Spiker will provide a written response to any unanswered questions that we might have if you don't get time to answer everything. We're also happy for any of you to contact us directly for clarification, any further information. Please provide us feedback at the end of today's session on any other subjects you would like us to cover in this roadshow, and also anything else you would like to see. Thank you. Just a couple of I suppose rules of engagement. Firstly, the panel is cognizant of what's happening in New Zealand, where you are in your current state of reforms, and some of the challenges and issues you are facing. We're talking about the Australian reforms, and today in particularly the Victorian reforms, to provide you a reference point to draw comparisons to what is happening in New Zealand. We'll endeavour to provide you with unbiased views, and essentially we'll be talking about today about the Victorian experience. To that point, we ask you to align your questions to the topic of today's session and also to our panelist. In other words, please don't ask any questions that are directed at the DIA, as the DIA is not here today. Bit of scene setting. Water is complex, and Australia has faced and continues to face many challenges. We will talk about what the reforms have delivered today in Victoria, and how they were delivered, and what worked and what didn't work well. I will start by providing a high-level context and scene setting within both the Australian and the Victorian water landscape. The story of the Victorian water reform spans more than 30 years. It's been an exciting and complex journey that involves policies, institutional transformation, and this work still continues today. The reforms can be split into two periods, and we will talk about them along these lines. The initial ones between 1980 and 1993, and from 1993 onwards. The story of what happened in Melbourne is different to what happened in regional Victoria. However, the drivers were not dissimilar, being water quality, the need to raise capital to invest in infrastructure, and also the need to have competition by comparison to drive performance and efficiencies. We'll try and tell the best story we can within the constraints of the time we have, within the New Zealand context and your current state. So this is Australia. Australia consists of 8 states and territories, and we essentially have 4 different models of water ownership. In Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, the Northern Territory, and the Australian Capital Territory, the water utilities are owned by the state or territory governments, 100% owned by them. In Tasmania, Taswater is owned jointly by the state government and by the 29 local councils there. Whereas in Queensland and in New South Wales, there is a mixture of ownership. Some entities are owned, especially the larger ones in metropolitan areas, are owned by the state, but there's still a significant number of local government owned ones in regional parts of the state, of those 2 states. So to Victoria. So this is what Victoria looks like in terms of its water landscape. We've got 15 urban water corporations. So an urban water corporation here is one that provides town reticulated water and sewage services. There are, in Melbourne's a little bit different, but essentially we have 15 across the states, and within Melbourne we have got 1 wholesaler, which is Melbourne Water, and 3 retailers, Great Western Water, Yarra Valley Water, and Southeast Water. Melbourne is a city of about 5.5 million people, and we'll go through how the Melbourne landscape was established. But essentially, each of those entities is a significant corporation in its own. Craig? Thank you. We've also got 4 rural water services across the state. These are rural water companies that provide irrigation water to farming communities. While they all look kind of big, Goulburn Water, the one in grey, Goulburn Murray Water, the one in grey in the middle, is by far the largest, and I think carries about 80% of the irrigation water provided to the state. Today's panel of speakers is a group of very highly experienced water and government executives. Each has over 30 years of experience. Dennis Kavanagh is a former commissioner of the Essential Services Commission of Victoria. That is the economic regulator here in Victoria. Was also a member of the Water Resources Department during the restructuring of the Victorian water industry. Served as managing director of Southeast Water in Melbourne, and was also a member of the inaugural board of the Queensland Urban Utilities. Russell Cooper was the founding managing director of Southeast Water. Was also a managing director of Goulburn Murray Water. So he provides an interesting insight into running a large metropolitan and a smaller regional one. He's also a managing director of Suez and Degramol, Suez/Degramol for both Australia and New Zealand, and he's got some insight into the New Zealand sector as a result of that experience. And he was also a member of the Ministerial Advisory Panel on Water. Michael King is a former deputy mayor of the city of Geelong. Geelong is just south of Melbourne. It's a significant city south of Melbourne. He's also the chair of Barwon Water and provides a good insight, having been both on local government and on the water utility side. He's also a member of the Regional Development Committee for the Southwest Coast of Victoria, and currently sits on several boards. So I thank all the panels for being here today, and I will hand it over to Dennis to talk about the first stage of the reforms.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone over there in New Zealand. Hopefully I can elaborate over a period of going back some 40 years. I want to talk about that, and that's called stage 1 of our reform, and that's from about 1980 through to 93. And that's the time when I also joined the water industry in the department ministry. The situation some 40 years ago that there were 343 separate water and sewerage authorities. Some were independent parts of government, some were independent water trusts, some were separate water entities, such as sewerage authorities, and some were functions of local councils. In fact, a lot of them were functions of local councils. As I said, there was a Ministry of Water Resources, which changed to a water department during this early process. The issues at the time with the 300 plus authorities was probably similar to many other places at the time. Drinking water quality remained an issue. There was cross-subsidisation within organisations. Government subsidies were growing, both interest subsidies and what they call revenue subsidies. There was growing financial demands to sewer townships and some major areas of growth around some of the bigger authorities. Very interestingly, there was a push by some of the independent water authorities to try and improve the management of the industry, particularly as there was a high reliance by the smaller authorities on government for both technical and financial advice. So back in the early 1980s, the Parliament formed a bipartisan parliamentary committee to conduct a public bodies review. Might I add is that this is a process which went over at least 12 months and also involved a lot of public hearings in Parliament, committee rooms. So a lot of representation by the councils, by the various authorities were made to that committee. Following the result of that review, the result was they recommended amalgamations to try and achieve those economies and the technologies which were required to bring the industry up to scratch. And as a result, over a 12-year period, the 343 reduced to approximately 84 in this first stage of reform. It took 12 years to achieve that. The kind of process in high-level terms was that the ministry and department prepared the business cases and the legal things and the briefings, etc., to work through to the time that the decision was made to amalgamate and who was coming into each of the amalgamations. The implementation of those new bodies was undertaken by task groups which were formed from the various merging authorities. Look, I'll hand over to Russell to talk about the next stage of reform.
Thank you, Dennis, and welcome everyone to this session today. So from about 1993 onwards, as Dennis said, there were about 84 entities, water entities in the state of Victoria. And in the space of a couple of years, from 93 to 95, that 84 had dropped down further to something like 20. 1995 was when I joined the water industry as the Managing Director of South East Water, as it had just been broken up from the former Melbourne Water combined entity. In 1993, the Jeff Kennett government had come into power to control a state that was in a fairly dire sort of situation economically. And at that stage, electricity, gas and water were all owned by the state government. And one of the desires of the new Kennett government was, in fact, to privatise electricity and gas and then water. They went forward to do the privatisation of electricity and gas in a short space of time. They generated a lot more money than had been expected, and they basically backed away from privatising water. So even though water had been set up in corporate entities with South East Water and the other retailers in Melbourne, it didn't go down that same path as electricity and gas. In those days, Victoria was keen to restore its AAA rating, and this was part of the plan with the new government. They're also keen to change the scale of the water businesses so that they were better able to borrow their capital, attract talent, and take on larger scale projects. Throughout this time, water quality was still an issue, and improvements to water quality was a key driver throughout the state, not just the metropolitan area. So at that point in time, in the mid-90s, 13 regional water entities had been created. They had the scale to raise capital and attract talent, and the former Melbourne Water had been disaggregated into a wholesaler, which unfortunately was also called Melbourne Water. It caused a great deal of confusion at the time, and the three retailers of Yarra Valley Water, City West Water and South East Water. As part of creating the three retailers, and indeed thinking that privatisation might have been on the agenda shortly thereafter, there was a desire to set them up as corporations, to have the boards appointed who were highly skilled people with high reputations, and the competition by comparison regime was created to try and drive some significant improvements in the businesses. So we move to the next slide, please. So I think we might have missed one there, did we? Next slide.
No, I think we're right. So now we talk about the benefits, which Michael will take us through the benefit.
Okay.
So just before you do that, sorry, Russell, have you completed?
Well, look, I think that's fine. Yes, I think that's fine. Thank you.
No worries. Michael.
Good. Thanks, Russell, and thanks, Dennis, and good morning to everyone listening in today. I think first up, a little bit of a context in relation to my positions. So my observations are taken over a 30-year period, first as an elected councillor and then as an appointed chairman of Barwon Water. So I was a councillor at the City of Geelong from 1988 to 1993, and I was really there as a councillor, but also just witnessing firsthand, I guess, the first wave of the water reforms that have been talked about previously this morning. And then some 20 years later, witnessing, as I came back into the water industry, the real benefits of the reform that had started back through the 80s and 1990s. So my observations from my time as a councillor, and as was talked about a little bit earlier by Dennis, there was then some 343 authorities that were reduced to 84. And my view at the time from speaking to senior council officers and senior management, that there was a general consensus that reform was needed. And there was some issues back through that time of a variable water quality. Water projects weren't top of mind at councils in those times. And as I remember, often the newly minted junior engineers were given the jobs because in those days it perhaps wasn't a 24-hour servicing that was required. The junior engineers were required to go out at night if there was an issue. So hence they got the job as part of their first step on the run. At a council level, there didn't seem to be a real focus on asset management or capital projects within the water side of the council. And there was often competing interests at a council level. So if a project was up, for example, of an upgrade of a swimming pool, that got precedence over a sewage treatment plant upgrade. And there was some real concerns as people projected forward from the future liabilities for council for the capital expenditure projects that were required. Then if I fast forward 20 years to my time then coming back as a chairman of Barwon Water, and I should just give a little bit of a brief background of Barwon Water as a regional water authority. Geelong southwest of Melbourne has a population of some 250,000 residents in the surrounding area, had a land area of over 8,000 square kilometres and had around 400,000 connections in terms of the scale. In my time there, we had an asset base of some $2.5 billion, but interestingly enough, 40% of that, from about the 1.7 billion to get to the 2.5 billion, came over a 5-year period where we entered into a private partnership agreement with GHD and John Halland and ourselves to be able to fast forward those new capital expenditure projects. Just very briefly, from the benefits that I witnessed coming into the water industry from previously being a council, and there was many benefits, but I'll just try and put them into 3 pillars as I saw them. I think by focusing as a very specialised industry, the water industry is, under the first pillar of what I'd call human capital, I saw the organisation that had really grown its depth. There was a real professionalism of the officers at all levels. The IP was captured and good succession plans were being put into place. And there was a real focus on professional development at all levels. In terms of the second pillar of what I'd call asset capital, there was very much improved systems, there was better technology outcomes, better capital maintenance allocation that didn't always occur when the councils had control back in the 80s and 90s. There was much greater focus on specialised asset management and systems, and overall there was just far better efficiencies. And then the third pillar in relation to what I'd call financial capital, by coming down from 343 authorities to 84, and then ultimately the 15 authorities we had today, it led to a huge, I guess, economies of scale and much better purchasing power. And that stronger balance sheet led to being able to capture a AAA credit rating, and was able to really leverage the balance sheet to borrow at then historic low interest rates, even lower today in COVID times. And that allowed us to be able to fund projects that perhaps wouldn't have happened in smaller towns before. By having that bigger scale and leveraging the balance sheet, we're able to do a number of projects in smaller towns that perhaps wouldn't have had that ability before under a council outcome. So in summary, the main benefits that I saw from between a time in council and then the water sector was both organisations were able to just concentrate in their own areas of expertise and their core business. that led certainly in the water sector to huge efficiencies and a much better financial management. So thank you for your time, and I'll just hand back to Dennis now.
Thank you, Michael. And I thought I'd just highlight a couple of issues. Some things don't always go to plan, and certainly, pardon me, that was one of the problems that we certainly experienced. The first issue, I think, was the review. The first stage review just took too long. 12 years was a long time to try and gain all those efficiencies and benefits, because it was done in an incremental way. There didn't seem to be any major plan for a whole of long-term look of Victoria. It was really done incrementally, using looking at sub-regions or catchments, so that it took a while to, I guess, negotiate right through the process. Caution was taken, I think, and there wasn't any real model to work from. So unfortunately, after 12 years of reform, something still needed to happen. And I think that's what led to the stage 2 reforms. Secondly, under the transitional arrangements, staff could move from old entities to the new entities and keep their entitlements, etc. Unfortunately, I think there was a number of poor moves, and unfortunately, some of those people had to be moved out of the water industry, obviously with entitlements and redundancy payments. But with hindsight, some of that wasn't as good as perhaps it could have been done in elsewhere, and has experienced well in other places like Tasmania. And finally, I think in the last 10 years, that's probably fair to say, there's been some legislative changes that have probably meant that the government's had a little bit more hands-on these days than it did originally. The government owned the organisations, and some of the decisions which previously were taken by the corporatised organisations had to be referred back to government. And also a few appointments to the boards tended to be somewhat political. That's not a dominant situation, but some of them were political appointments. Next slide. Yeah, just briefly talking about engagement during the reforms. The first stage of reforms over that 12-year period, I should say that even the parliamentary review that led to the first stage, there were hearings, and a lot of representation was made at those parliamentary committee hearings by councils and by water authorities, members, etc. During that 12-year period, during the incremental reforms, certainly there were various types of engagements. There were public meetings, there were small meetings and gatherings with key people. The ones that seemed to work best were the smaller meetings where informed people could meet with decision makers or influencers of decision makers around the table, where key issues could be discussed fully and frankly. Even if at the end people didn't agree, it certainly allowed the issues to be well aired and discussed. Very hard to do that in a public meeting, where I think a lot of the issues get bounced around. Unfortunately, in the second stage, there wasn't a lot of engagement with councils or water authorities. It was very much led by, in the case of Metro, by the Treasury Department, and in the case of the regional authorities, by the Department of Water. So it was put in place very quickly in about 6 months, but that didn't allow much engagement. The decisions were made. Currently, there's a lot of engagement with customers because that's part of the regulatory program now, so that there's an enormous amount of input from customer committees, customer engagement and customer committees attached to each of the major authorities, both regional and metro, and they have a lot of input into all the business planning processes before it goes to the regulator for price assessment and approval. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Look, we'll talk more about engagement in a later session we've got planned for this roadshow. Okay, so that concludes sort of, I suppose, our presentation part of today's forum. As we go forward from here, we will just be taking questions from the audience and talk and addressing and answering those questions. I've got a first question here from Noel Roberts. Noel's asking, how is stormwater managed in Victoria? So first question is, how is stormwater managed? Is it controlled by council or by the water entities? Russell, maybe you can start.
Yes, well, in metropolitan Melbourne, the stormwater initially is controlled by the councils, the multiple councils across the area. They collect the stormwater and they pass it into bigger and bigger drains. And the larger pipes, maybe of the order of a 1.5 metre diameter or larger, are then under the control of Melbourne Water, where it's then, the water is then released into usually the bay or maybe the Yarra River. So it's a bit of a mixture of councils then going through to Melbourne Water. If you go into regional Victoria, it's basically the councils who would be collecting the stormwater and handling it accordingly. But there is a growing move to look at stormwater as a resource, and a lot of water authorities are now starting to look at, well, what could be done beneficially with stormwater to make use of that as a new water resource. So it's going to change, I should think.
So you've preempted the follow-up question with that. In hindsight, would you have put all three waters together during the reforms when we created the corporations?
Look, I think the way it started off is fine, but as I say, there's scope now to look at capturing stormwater and reusing it in different ways. And of course, unlike New Zealand, a lot of Australia is usually quite short on water, and certainly in the state of Victoria, over the years, a number of plans have come forward to actually increase the resource to cater for the growing population. For example, there's the desalination plant at Wonthaggi in regional Victoria, which was built some years ago to provide a significant, I think, 160 gigalitre resource of water coming, of course, from seawater. There was also an infrastructure adjustment with the north-south pipeline to take water from the north down to Melbourne. This is all about really getting ready to handle the growing population. So stormwater reuse is going to be something which will get more and more attention as time goes by. But unfortunately, of course, stormwater carries a number of impurities with it. So it's not a question of just putting it straight into people's taps. It has to go through some degree of treatment, plant, etc.
Thank you. Just also, we will be doing a separate session on stormwater a little bit later too. Okay, I will. This is a question left over from the other day, but I'll ask it now. Where did the government buy the assets of the councils? Were the councils in any way reimbursed or compensated for the loss of their water assets? Dennis?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. The assets and the liabilities were transferred at book value from the entities, whether it be from the Water Trust, whether it be from a division of the council. They came over at net book value.
So no money, they were not purchased. So the councils had to
they had to pass over any of the assets. They could be debtors, they also could be cash. Mm-hmm. There were sinking funds at that stage, and a lot of those sinking funds were put into small savings accounts. And I do recall in my involvement with in one of the major restructures, we ended up with 200 passbooks, 200 passbooks from banks. So certainly, yeah, they just moved over. There was no profit taking by anybody.
Thank you. Michael, we're going to, no? I've got a question for you, Michael. Does the resident business community accept today that they are receiving good value, better quality and better delivery of services for the water?
I believe they do. my sense of when the reforms happened, as long as the water came out of the tap and they could flush the toilet, they didn't think too much about how that happened. You soon hear very quickly if things aren't going right and the people are unhappy, and there was a very low level of complaint process, and there was a number of mechanisms around that people could complain. But I haven't heard anything directly back from a residential perspective, and if anything, I think they're more than happy with the services provided, but there's not a great deal of thought that goes towards it.
Thank you. Another question. This one's from Glenn Raynham. Sorry. What process did you put in place to ensure that these water businesses met the growth and planning requirements established by various local councils? So in other words, how did the water entities work with local councils to meet and work with them around the growth and planning requirements?
Perhaps I could kick that one off, Mark. I think the thing that's been searched for throughout the reform process here in Victoria has been one of sort of critical mass, to get the entities to a certain size, a significant size, where they can generate sufficient profits to be able to pay for their capital works requirements, and indeed in the case of Melbourne to provide a dividend back to the owner, which is the state of Victoria. So I think searching for critical mass is something we've seen going in both directions. Before the disaggregation of the former Melbourne Water, there was actually a growing together the MMBW with outlying regional bodies like the Mornington Peninsula Water Board. So there we are with a metropolitan area getting bigger, and not many years later being disaggregated. It was always, I think, searching for that critical mass that was able to provide the services required. And the services required keep growing. And I didn't mention before, but one of the big issues that's happening now is the reuse of treated wastewater. In the case of Western Water, where I was a board director, they had reached the stage where treated wastewater was going through a third pipe into people's homes, purple pipes to differentiate them from the other supply pipes. And the water was being used in washing machines, obviously in toilets, clothes washing machines, and those sorts of things. So there's quite a significant change was occurring in that area of reuse. And I think we'll see more of that again because of this resource issue we have, particularly in Victoria, where we're always looking for more water to meet the needs of a growing population.
From a Bowen Water perspective, so any development applications, there was a referral process in place that came to the Water Authority, but separate to that, we always arrange quarterly meetings with the senior staff of council because we wanted to be ahead of the growth curve and not have any surprises. So most of our, medium to long range planning was around 5 to 10 years. So we wanted to be ahead of that growth curve and met with senior council officers, and there was just good cross-fertilisation at a lower ranking level between the two authorities, and that was an important part of our engagement from a development perspective and with the council senior staff.
Thanks, Michael. Next question is from Ulrich Glasner. Was there a feeling throughout the reform process that elected members and communities were losing their democratic rights? Perhaps, Michael, you could, I'll shoot it to you. You were kind of an elected member at the time.
I think at the time I was elected, there was a little bit of a relief around our urban area that we were actually starting the first wave of water reforms. Certainly the second wave, it was just enforced. My own view is that as long as it was done in an efficient way and people could turn their taps on, have good drinking water quality and could flush their toilets, there wasn't a concern while all that was happening. And there was a good pricing pathway within all that. I think from my perspective, we haven't touched on yet, the regulatory reform through the Essential Services Commission was an important part of that process, but I didn't detect a real concern as long as the organisation was running the place efficiently and people could get what they wanted at a reasonable price. So no real problems, I didn't think, from occurring in the Geelong region anyway. I don't know, Dennis or Russell, whether you had any separate views on that.
Thanks, Michael. Look, it's hard to know. I'm going back 40 years and thinking what were the reactions then. I would think there were probably some people who were very concerned about losing their position. I don't know about democracy, but more about their actual direct influence on what was happening. But when you speak to, or certainly when I spoke to people who had joined the new entities and previously been in some of the older councils, etc., they were pleased to know that what they didn't originally, they didn't know what they didn't know. And when the new entities were created, some of the problems were hidden from those smaller entities. So they actually got comfort, consequently, from having the larger entity created. So any indication of loss of, influence, etc., was certainly replaced by the fact that they knew that the customers were getting a better deal.
Thank you.
I think the only other thing I'd add to that, Mark, is if I may, is that at the time of the disaggregation of Melbourne and the creation of South East Water, etc., the term corporatisation was used quite strongly as a means of improving the way the businesses worked in preparation for potential later privatisation, which, as I say, never happened. That was a term that was not well accepted by the general public. Corporatisation was really just, it didn't mean anything. And I remember we had many people who said, well, you've been privatised. They thought corporatisation meant we'd already gone down the path and been privatised. And they thought, in a consequence of all of that, they thought, well, they've lost some of their perhaps democratic rights to the provision of water and sewage services. We had to continually explain, no, we've just been corporatised. It means we're trying to provide a different level of control of the business to improve it, to be more customer responsive. So you've actually got nothing to worry about. But it was an ongoing battle. The word corporatisation is not well understood amongst the public. Certainly wasn't in those days.
I think it touches on what you were talking about earlier too, and it's a need to engage and communicate with people in an effective manner, in an intelligent way, and that sort of thing. I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that.
No, I fully agree, Mark. And it's best done when people are informed. And even with the new customer consultation groups that each of the entities have now, one of the key parts is to actually educate those people about the water industry before they can really fully participate as a member of that consultation body. I think that's really important. And that happened if you have educated people, knowledgeable people, interfacing with the decision makers, then you're going to get a good result.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question, and I must stay with you, Dennis, for this one,
Yep.
is from Don McLeod, and it's about the regulator. And the question reads, is the power of the water authorities to charge effectively a property tax or payment for services and enforced as per normal utility processes? So essentially, how do we work out our pricing and how do we charge people for what they use?
Yeah, back in the 80s, most of the water authorities got off the rate base, as it were, property-based taxes. So all the charges
Sorry,
now...
so to clarify that was based on the value of the property, correct?
Yeah, based on the value of the property. So it's now all changed now, and people pay a fixed charge depending on the size of the water connection, and then they pay, in some cases, a fixed charge or a variable charge for their sewage, and for water they also get metered and they pay for volume. So you've got a fixed charge and a variable charge, and that's part of a process that's consulted with the customers, and then you prepare it into your 3 to 5 year business plan. That goes to the regulator, the Essential Services Commission. They assess it, there's interaction with the authority, and then finally something's approved in terms of a 3 to 5 year plan pricing path.
So there's two-part pricing: fixed connection cost and usage, correct?
That's yes for water, and most of sewerage there's a formula-based charge based on the amount of water you consume. There's a somewhat complex and perhaps something that might change in the future that charges people based on an assumed volume of sewerage that returns back to the sewer. So it's a formula based on what the water you consume.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Dawn Baxendale. And Dawn's asking, she's interested to know what was the impact on councils and their credit ratings as a result of these reforms. Michael, do you have a recollection of what happened in your patch of
look, I don't from back then. No, I don't.
Okay.
Look, I could throw an element in there. Is that I recall that we had a number of issues with pipe bursts that would be going down the nature strips around residential properties, and our people would go out and fix the pipe, but invariably there'd be the crossover, the driveway into the person's home, which would be fixed up in a temporary manner, and that asset, the crossover, was the council's property. So in the early days at South East Water, we would have a situation, we were trying very hard to improve customer service. We'd have a situation where someone's had experienced a pipe burst out the front of their house. The water company had come along and fixed it and left their driveway crossover in a temporary gravelled over sort of manner. And they'd be grumbling to us about, why didn't you fix it? Not our asset, we couldn't fix it. Send them off to the council. Council say, well, it's not in our works program for this next period, you know, and the customer was very unhappy. We came up with a plan for the Water Authority to talk to each of the councils. We had a number of councils in a third of the Melbourne area. I can't remember exactly how many, but it was 20 or 30 councils as I recall, maybe more. And we went to each council and said, how about when we fix our pipe, we fix your asset, put it back to how it was? Oh, the first response, well, you couldn't do that because every council's got different standards of crossovers. So, well, what about if we fix it to your standard? We have an agreement between the Water Authority and Council A, and we'll fix it to your standard, because our asset had destroyed their asset. We were liable for the cost anyway. We might as well fix it at the time. Customers happy, problem goes away. And it worked really well. We went around each of the councils one by one and said, this is what we can do to make your customers and our customers, mutual customers, a whole lot happier. You know, do you agree with it? It was a clear win-win program, as I recall.
Great, thanks. Dawn, I just asked you to clarify your question, and we might have to come back to you with an answer for this, but you are talking about the credit rating of councils as a result of the reforms. Just clarify that, and I will come back to you with an answer after this. Similarly, the reform program for local government, we are going to touch on this at a later session, so we won't go there today, but if you can clarify your question, I'll try and give you an answer, at least in the short term, about that. Another question, just Noel, you asked a question that was debt transferred with the asset. I think we've already answered that, and the answer is yes, it certainly was transferred. A question from Matt Layton. How was engagement with Aboriginal communities and stakeholders undertaken?
I could have a crack at that. I think in the early days, from my experience, we didn't do very much. We didn't do very much at all. But I was involved in more recent times with a new water industry bill that was being proposed. This is in 2014-15. And the level of consultation in a couple of decades had changed enormously. And a key part of that water consultation for the new industry bill, which by the way didn't happen because there was a change of government just after all the work had been completed, and the new government didn't see it as their highest priority. But as part of getting ready for this new water industry bill, there was a requirement to consult with every stakeholder, including Indigenous communities. And so we did some significant consultation with Indigenous groups in Victoria. We brought in representatives from different, as people know, there are different groups around the state. So we brought them in as sort of representing their particular group. There was probably a bit of a mistake that was made at the time, and it's all very good to sort of have the hindsight to go back and think about that. But the mistake was that by virtue of asking for the consultation to occur, we probably had created a false expectation amongst some of those Indigenous groups of gaining greater water entitlements. That was never the intent, and there was a fair bit of sort of unwinding of unrealistic expectations that had to be done after the event. There was a little bit of unnecessary angst that we really created ourselves. So it was very much a learning exercise. At the end of the day, we were able to come up with a reasonable outcome, but it wasn't without some degree of difficulty along the way.
Thanks, Russell. Just
Mark, I think you've got a session coming up with some current MDs, and there's been a lot of really good work being done over the last 5 or 6 years that they'll be able to speak to. But to Russell's comment, the engagement was virtually non-existent through the late 80s and early 90s.
Thank you, Michael. And we also, besides the session we're doing with current MDs, we've also got one a little bit later planned with Indigenous leaders also. The next question is from Dawn, and Dawn, I did get a note that you were asking about credit ratings of councils, and I will come back to you with an answer on that. This new question from Dawn is: what was the impact on the cost on residents, recognizing that they were originally paying one council bill, and now they would be paying two bills, one obviously for the rates, another one for the water? How did customers receive that, and what impact did it have on them?
Perhaps I can jump in there. Initially, it was interesting. Some of the financial years were different between the water authorities and the sewage authorities. So I can talk of one particular example where when the new bills went out from the water authority, it had 9 months of sewage and 12 months of water, because that was the bringing together. So in fact, the people, once they realised it was only 9 months, then there was a little bit of communication required there. It all boiled down to communication. How well did you communicate that this was a new entity and the council remained as the older entity? So you had to explain that the future rates bill they were going to get was going to be a lot less. And the water component of that bill, or the sewage component of that bill, whatever was on that other bill, was now part of the new water entity. It was purely a communication issue. It took some time to sort out in some areas, but it certainly isn't an issue anymore.
Thank you. The next question is from Andrew Chin. Question is: some councils here have raised concerns that a separate water entity may not align with the council land use priorities, and they will lose their ability to influence how and where the city grows. Have these types of issues occurred in Victoria after the reform? So have the water authority been in conflict with the council over land use and growth plans? I think you've touched on it a little bit, Michael, in terms of how you work together. But
Look, we've worked together. I don't believe it has, but I think Russell and Dennis are more hands-on, would be able to be better answer to that. My initial view is that it didn't.
No. As I recall, the water entities had some input into, where development ought to occur, but they didn't dictate that. That was done by the planning authority, if I recall, Russell, and councils. So the water authorities had influence, but didn't dictate.
And I think, further to that, Dennis, I agree with that. I think really the water authorities work fairly cooperatively with the council in terms of land use planning issues. I can recall a couple where some defunct wastewater treatment plants were going to be closed down. And as part of that process, even before anything had happened, the water authorities, not just South East Water, but others across the state, were talking to the council about this is the plan. These are the things that could happen here. You know, do you agree with this? Would you like to go this way or that way? In some cases, the land was zoned for residential redevelopment because some of these were big plots of land, especially around the metropolitan area. And other cases have been used as recreational park type areas. So all that was done in consultation with the councils. And I don't think there were many issues of disputations or misunderstanding. I think it all worked pretty smoothly, I think.
And would I be right in saying that the council would come up with its growth plans, its development plans, etc., what it wants to do with its city, etc. The water authority would be told about that and meet any requirements it needs. You know, it's not an overnight thing. It's a long-term planning process, and the water authority builds it into its own capital program.
I think that was right. It was really an iterative process in both directions. And I guess most of the focus was on, you know, we want to make this particular change here for that reason. And it could be led from either side, the council or the water authority. And it might be something to do with green wedge arrangements to enhance the green wedge or to preserve the green wedge, in other words, to make sure that the residents were getting a fair deal. So I think it all worked fairly well, to be quite honest.
Yeah, there was no usurping of the council authorities.
Yep. Okay, great. The other question, and we are going to talk about governance and board selections at a later session, but I will pose this question, is there any community influence in governance structure? And I assume that extends to board selection in Victoria.
Well, I think that we've gone through a couple of different phases. I mean, the phase that I came into at the start of South East Water was one of, as I said before, corporatisation, businesses being set up ready for to be sold off, and the government through the Treasury having selected individuals to be on the boards who had the right sort of backgrounds to be able to do that. My chairman, for example, was a guy called Rick Charlton, who was the former boss of Shell Australia. So he came to that role with pretty high credentials, and all of the other directors at the time were the same way. As time went by, the corporatisation aspect slipped away. In time, there was a change of Water Act, which allowed everything across the state to be brought under one particular act, which in itself was a bit of a problem, and still is because of the confusions there. And other parts of government, like the Department of Water, started to get involved with recommending people to be appointed to boards, and then the water minister of the day would then make the final selection, and sometimes it was not always on the best choices. It was a question of what suited that minister at that particular point in time. So there was a mixture of people who had appropriate backgrounds and others who might have been being rewarded for efforts provided in the past to the party.
So certainly there was a public call for applications going out from the government. I think in the case of the time I was appointed, there was 130 applications from the public. That was whittled down by a subgroup of 5 representatives from the department and some independent people, albeit appointed by the minister. And then that was really a 45-minute interview process of, I think, up to 50 people to make sure there was a skills-based board appointed, but ultimately the government or the minister of the day made the final decisions, but it was people from the public could apply and did.
Thank you. Please post any more questions. I've got another one that's actually a leftover from the other day. And in terms of the question around the forecast expected efficiencies and productivity gains and improvements, were they attained, particularly the efficiencies and productivity gains? Do we believe that they were attained in terms of what was expected?
Look, I'll take that one first, Mark. From my experience, they were overachieved. You know, the business cases were prepared before the mergers or the amalgamations occurred, but invariably the savings were even better than were expected. And some of those things came out of the woodwork that weren't expected, e.g. Revenue that was perhaps overlooked previously. There may have been older systems in place where you weren't able to identify leakages and you weren't able to identify unmetered services, etc. Those provided opportunities to increase the revenue base, to increase the efficiencies. And of course, there was a lot of efficiencies from the economies of scale once the amalgamations started to occur. So overall, I would think it was overachieved. And the other thing is, I think some of the forecast capital works were probably overstated initially when it was aggregated together when you were doing the business cases, that once you got into place, you're able to do some more economies and get some efficiencies and perhaps stagger some of the investments, but still achieve the outcomes that you needed to achieve.
From where I sat, I think I'd agree with Dennis. So we had a 5-year pricing plan that we had to submit to the Essential Services Commission, and there was a number of projects that we wanted to do. And then when you start really just drilling down within the organisation, you'd look for those efficiencies to help fund those new capital projects, perhaps in smaller towns that normally wouldn't have got that. And then through that process, you'd perhaps sometimes look at some lazy assets. So Russell mentioned before about some of the disused water basins, and some went back to environmental community purposes, others were rezoned, and some of the proceeds of that could then go into a next lot of the project, and always at the same time looking at reducing what the current rate price was. And in our 5-year pricing plan, we actually came in at minus 1.7% through efficiencies, looking at lazy assets to be able to put back into projects that normally wouldn't be funded. So I'd agree with Dennis. I think we overachieved on efficiencies.
Mark, if I could just add another dimension, I agree with Dennis and Michael's comments, but because I've sort of worked on both sides of the table in terms of running water authorities on the one side and running a business, Suez business, Degremont business that builds plants for water authorities and operated under a number of BOOT schemes. BOOT scheme stands for build, own, operate, and then transfer. I mean, when you've got private sector operators running BOOT schemes for a water filtration plant or a water purification plant or a wastewater treatment plant, they've got one objective that's pretty much uppermost in their mind, and that is to make a profit. And to make a profit on the initial building of the plant, and indeed to make a profit on the operation of the plant through its lifetime, which might be 20 or 25 years before it's transferred to the water authority. So, in fact, in the case of New Zealand, we had plants in Mangere in Auckland, Manukau, and another plant in Lower Hutt Valley in Wellington. And the latter one was clearly a BOOT scheme and was about to come to an end, I think, next year or the year after. Well, all of those sorts of projects need to be well controlled from the authority side. And if the authority's not big enough or capable enough to actually do the check and balance on the contractor, the contractors group, then things could go a little bit off tangent, if you like. So I think the benefit of the aggregation of the businesses in Victoria, maybe the same case may happen in New Zealand, is that there was a critical mass form where they could either do some of those works themselves, or more particularly, better supervise the works that are being done by external contractors. Either way, they're going to end up with a better result. It's only when you have a situation where an authority doesn't have sufficient internal resource to control the works of external contractors that things can go pear-shaped.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, everyone. Next question is from Noel Roberts, and I'll direct it initially to you, I think, Dennis. Is the deregulatory reform, economic drinking water quality and environmental protection or performance, occur at the same time as the industry reform?
The economic reform occurred once the power industry was privatised. That was probably 15 years after the initial reforms, so about the mid-1990s. So it was fairly early in the later reforms. It was going. So there was a regulator, a proper regulator put in place called the Office of Regulator General, which became the Essential Services Commission. So I guess that was when there were a small number of bodies that were operating pretty efficiently. The regulation came into place on the economic side. As far as water quality goes, the regulation there is done by the Department of Health, and that's been going for a long time, and as long as the water reform's been there. And the Environmental Protection Authority that manages the water effluent qualities and etc. in regard to environment, well, that's been there since day one too. So they're the three, I guess, key regulators. Does that cover the thing, do you think, Mark?
I think so. So obviously the health, the drinking water quality and environmental protection standards, I mean, they've evolved over time, obviously, particularly the EPA stuff, and probably come stricter and stricter over time. And so they've evolved with the industry and the reforms, and the economic regulation has probably matured and become better as a result of the reforms.
Yes, it certainly is the economic regulator is a key thing, because it's really bringing into play the expenditures you've got to do on the other matters. So the regulation water, the regulation environment are part of the inputs into the works programs of the authorities, which then comes into the business plan or the corporate plan, which is then presented following consultation with customers, etc., then presented to the Essential Services Commission as far as a pricing path goes.
Right, thank you. Okay. This question is from Mohammed, and I like this question, is how was the water and wastewater workforce capacity and capability developed to meet the needs of the new entities? So part of the question is how were people transferred, I guess, and then secondly is how was that capability developed and increased?
Well, I could have a first go at it. Pardon me. Firstly, the project teams that were set up for each of the merger entities, they did the work in terms of selection of staff that went into the new entities. Certainly in the case of the smaller regional mergers that occurred, there were certain staff that were already working in those councils or in those small water trusts that transferred over. Sometimes there weren't the skills in-house, and they did recruit from the various consulting engineers or from other bodies. But certainly when the bigger authorities got going, they certainly had to bring in more skills. So it was a mixture of bringing existing people into play, certainly also retraining them, but also mixing them with some of the external people from industry, from consulting engineers, etc. I think that's basically how it developed. There was a lot of in-house development and industry development. There were associations where authorities helped each other to solve problems and to share experiences.
Perhaps another dimension to that is in the early days, there was always the ongoing issue of gender balance in terms of structuring of the management, even the middle management. And the question would often be raised about why don't you have more females in the business? If you go back far enough, to the time when I was at university, there was only one female in my class in engineering at Melbourne University. Today it's probably 50%. So it's probably gone from 1 or 2% to 50% over many, many decades. The reality is we didn't have many folk to choose from in those early days. And no matter what we wrote in our advertisements for senior engineers, middle ranking engineers, even junior engineers, we had difficulty finding the right applicants. So one of the things we actually created was a graduate intake program to bring in about 10 people per year as fresh graduates from university. We even had people going to the universities touting for, why don't you come and work for Southeast Water because we're a good bunch of folk and so on and so doing important work and what have you. And we tried to bring in 50-50 males and females, whether they were from engineering or from science or environmental sciences or even economics, didn't really much matter, to try and to start to get a bit of a feed into the organisation. Now, clearly, a lot of the females who'd come in as early 20-year-olds, what have you, straight from university, would leave at some later stage and have a family. But we were conscious of trying to get them to enjoy the time they had with us, and perhaps even come back after their families and rise through the ranks. I think that's happened to a large degree now, and there's much more gender equity across all organisations, not just water authorities. But we were trying to do something quite positive in those very early days to affect that balance, and I think it worked to a degree.
I smiled a little bit as you were saying that. For the audience, as we go through this journey of sort of our roadshows, we've started in the past and we've gone back 20 or 30 years. As we come into the current, we will have a much more gender balanced panel. There's a number of managing directors, executive GMs across water in Victoria and in Tasmania that will be presenting. A mixture of males and females. So I suppose we've gone back 20, 30 years in time where things weren't quite as balanced. Today, it's a very different story. Another question from Dawn, and we are going to go and talk about boards now a little bit. How have the boards, and you touched on this, Dennis, how have the boards evolved, and would you describe then as diverse as well as skilled? So how have the boards evolved, and would you describe them as being both diverse and skilled, or not?
Well, perhaps if we go back, the early boards, and the one that I was particularly associated with was a board that covered about 6 council areas. And in the negotiations before it was finally established, it was agreed that 1 representative from each council, elected by the council, would be on the board, plus 3 government appointees. There was hopefully some experience that came in with those appointees, but they were mixed, in fair comment. So I'm talking about the mid-1980s, back in the early reforms. That changed in the 1990s with the change of the greater focus on corporatisation and the injection of skill-based boards. So it took a while to merge from the mid-80s through to the 90s, where skill-based boards were appointed, and they were appointed through that invitation process. And it was fair comment to say that there was a good spread of skills from engineering, environment, finance, legal. There was a good spread of skills on the board, certainly at Southeast Water, when that was initially started in the mid-1990s.
So I'd add to that from a water authority perspective, in our particular water authority, Barwon Water, we had a good gender diversity, 4 males, 3 females, had a mixture of skills, had chemical engineering, finance, law, retail. We had good CEO experience, and 2 of the 7 board members, particularly in that energy sector. And I don't think it was by design, but it happened over a succession of different appointments over a 10-year period. We always had someone from local government, and they weren't necessarily there from local government. They were there for their own particular skill set. So one in particular was a current councillor. After that, went to Europe, won the legal award for the best lawyer in Europe. So he had a very strong legal subset. And to the side of that, I guess we brought skills for our customer consultative committees, particularly within the environment, the customer consultative committee, with not just people involved in the community, but with strong skill sets within that. So, and we're perhaps, if I look back in hindsight, it would have been good to have someone on the board with a strong IT skill set, particularly when we migrated to a new financial modelling and billing system, and we had some real issues with that. And we had someone with a direct skill at that time, that would have been very useful. But overall, a very diverse skill-based group of directors.
Thanks, Michael. Dawn answered her question by saying that she raised this as a CEO in local government, both in the UK and in New Zealand, and believes the challenge New Zealand will face is getting skilled people to obviously sit on boards and also work in the corporations, and also making sure there is a balance of diversity on those boards. It is a problem. I think we've got a bigger pool of people here, but I think we still struggle in some places with that, and it's not an easy one to address. But I think you've got to set out to do it, don't you? I mean, you've got to want to have the right skills and the right diversity, and have that as a name of your sort of board structure. Okay. One more question from Priyana. How did the new water entities fare with the combined asset management frameworks, combined levels of service, and combined capital programs? Was the combination process challenging? So this is about bringing all these different systems and, I suppose, processes and procedures from different entities underneath into a combined one. The challenge of mergers, I suppose.
Do you want me to have a first go at this one? I just recall mostly there was a kind of a legacy system that provided the kind of piggyback system for the entities, so that I know as far as the major restructure I was involved with, the billing system couldn't be used from any of the councils or from the water authority that merged from, so they had to get their own. But as far as, say, the SCADA systems or the GIS systems, there was a piggyback system that could be used and developed, and you were able to populate that with the new data. So as far as the systems go, it was either a new one, a replacement one, or use one of the key legacy ones. Secondly, in terms of the programs of work, I don't think that was a really difficult task. Once you got the programs from the former authorities and you went through and you did an analysis and critical analysis of the needs, then I don't think that was a too difficult task, particularly when there was consultation back to the original authorities.
Thanks, Dennis. Anything to add, guys? No? The next question is from Tararua Council. And it's unrelated to water, but I think it's a good question unrelated to Victoria, but I think it's a good question to post. It appears that there are a number of regional councils that still manage their waters, especially in Queensland. Is this because the benefits were greater in higher populated areas to move them into state government? I think that's the question. Do we know why? So do we have a view as to why perhaps in Queensland and in New South Wales, there's still a number of council-owned and operated water utilities? Putting you on the spot a little bit, it's not your direct area.
It's difficult to answer that one. I was on the board at the Brisbane one called Queensland Urban Utilities, and that was from that came in from local government. And at the same time, there were two other water boards created in southeast Queensland, and one of them was created but didn't last. The councils pulled out of it after about 2 years. So there must be some interesting stories told. I'm not sure if I know the real facts of the cases there. I think perhaps you need to speak to the Brisbane people or the New South Wales people about that.
The only other thing I could add there, Mark, would be I think sometimes it's a function of the geography and the separation distances involved. For example, the distance between Brisbane and Cairns is enormous. Whatever. So the prospect of trying to organise things to happen in Cairns from Brisbane, from a water authority standpoint, just doesn't really make any sense. Whereas in the case of my involvement with New Zealand, as I mentioned before, with Wellington Council and Lower Hutt Valley Council being adjoining councils, for them to decide, and this is going back 15 odd years ago, to merge their water businesses together into one entity, made eminent sense because it was just sort of one side of Wellington Harbour almost to the other. So there was a very, very short distance, just made a lot of sense. So I think the physical distances come into play to a large degree, and even though you can handle some aspects of big distances with SCADA and remote control arrangements, telemetry, whatever, there's sometimes always that need to have physical boots on the ground or face-to-face involvement with the customers. So that's the challenge, I think, of any merger, as to how do you cope with the geography, the separation that's involved.
Thank you. Later on, we will be hearing from some of the MDs in Queensland and some of the stakeholders there. So that might, as I think they said, that's probably a question better directed at some of them. But I thought we'd have a crack at it with this panel also. Let's see. Sorry, one more question has come through. Sorry, I've just lost my frame. I've just lost my place. If I can add to something while I regain my place, if I can add to something Russell just said about the, I suppose, the tyranny of distances, I'll turn that on its head and talk about Western Australia. And Western Australia is almost half of Australia in terms of geography. There is only one statewide corporation called Water Corp, and that has managed to basically operate its water and sewage services as a single entity across a state that has gone through some very rapid growth in the last sort of 20 years of all the mining activity. We will hear from them again later on, but you can also make it work. Boots on ground is important, so you don't, manage everything from a central point. You do have a local presence. Water Corp Western Australia, for example, is divided into 5 regional sub corporations, you want to call it that, or sub entities, and they each manage their respective area, etc. So we do have another question here, and this one's from Donick. How was capital raised to fund the, I suppose, the investment following the integration or the reforms?
They're all raised basically through the, well, first of all, through banks. I know the Water Authority, which I was heavily involved with, got approval to raise money even before it got fully functional. That particular authority was set up 16 months before it was actually operational. In other words, a board was appointed, a number of us key staff were appointed. We managed the implementation using also staff from the old authorities, and then it got going about 16 months later. Now, in that particular case, we've got a borrowing authority for that transitional period, about 4.5 million, I think it was. And then after that, we went out to the market and we got approval to set up a facility to move that on. That was it was a fairly big size merger. In fact, the biggest one outside Melbourne. So they went to, usually they were all funding through the banks. And then in about 20 years ago, I think it was 30 years ago, there was a state borrowing authority set up called Treasury Corp. And the funding then was channeled through that particular organisation. So all the water authorities were borrowing through the Treasury Corporation of Victoria, and they actually had to also pay an accommodation fee because the borrowing of that corporation was very economical, but they wanted an accommodation fee to recognise that the water authorities were getting that benefit, and that margin, that extra margin, went back to the government to recognise that the authority was borrowing with the benefit of this major borrowing authority. And that's typical across, I think, most states now. They all have their own borrowing authorities. I don't know if I've covered everything there, Mark.
Follow up on that is international investors were not involved to raise capital. Is that correct?
Well, no,
unless in the boot scheme. That's
I think with Treasury Corporation of Victoria, they were raising money from all parts of the world. So they were acting as effectively the banker for all of the water authorities and getting some very good rates in terms of borrowings, to the extent that when you compared the rates that Treasury Corp would need to pay for borrowed money versus even the rates that my old firm, the Suez Corporation, would pay, and they were a very big firm, 100,000 people, what have you, they could never match the rates of Treasury Corp. So it was a difficult thing to be price competitive in terms of borrowings. So, but Treasury Corp were good at doing it because they were doing it around the world.
I should add that a couple of the authorities were raising money, issuing their own scrip. The big one in Melbourne, one of the original ones called Border Works, and I think Geelong as well, Michael, had their own issue of scrip, but that was very expensive. The administration plus the margins were too expensive, and in the end, everyone's gone through the Central Borrowing Authority.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll start wrapping it up now. I might ask, no more questions have come through. So I might ask each of the panel just to make a concluding comment, starting maybe with you, Michael.
Yep, thank you. I think as I came into the water sector after a 20-year hiatus from the council, I found some real efficiencies. So as I look at the reform before you guys in New Zealand, I'd say there was huge benefits to the customer, if you focus on the customer first, and particularly through being able to leverage our balance sheet. We're able to get in a very good position financially, which allowed, and with that cash, we're able to do some world-class projects that had huge environmental aspects, particularly as an example of Black Rock with an ocean outfall sewer that was around the 60 million plus mark that never would have happened. And we really did that off the back of a very strong financial position that had a great environmental outcome. So I guess the only other observation I'd make that if you've got a compromised position and a hard decision to make, go for the hard decision because it will have longer term benefits.
Thank you, Michael. Russell.
Well, firstly, could I begin by saying thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I wish you all the very best in your endeavours going forward, because it's very important in terms of supplying good quality drinking water to serve population and looking after all of the environmental needs that go with the wastewater and what have you. So the work that's being done there is vitally important. It's often not fully understood just how important it is. And of course, having the right structure is part of that. And I guess that's the mission or the journey that you're engaged on. I certainly wish you well with that. And I'd go back to the point I made a couple of times during my comments about seeking critical mass. In other words, it's not about getting the organisation too big that it loses touch with the population being served, but nor is it about keeping the organisations too small that they can't actually generate their own internal capabilities. Because even though any water authority anywhere in the world can make use of external contractors, such as the people I've worked for in the past, you also need to make sure that you've got the internal resources to do the checks and balances on what they're actually doing for you. So seeking that level of critical mass and to be able to generate sufficient, if you like, revenues and hence profits that flow from that to cover a lot of your internal capital expenditure needs is just so important as you go down that particular journey. So I wish you well. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. Dennis.
Thanks, Mark. I can only but endorse the comments of the other two. But what I'd like to also say is that, look, it probably wasn't easy for a lot of the councillors and a lot of the board members, etc., from the old authorities to go through the process. It was hard. I think it was hard for them to accept. But in the long run, if you look back, the real winner has been the customer. They get better product at a better price. And if that's the number one criteria, then you've just got to push through with reform. So I do wish New Zealand well, however they finally decide what to do. But I do wish you well. It's a tough road, but it's worth it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, guys, for being on the panel today. I also extend my thanks to you for allowing us to come and talk to you today, and also ask you for any feedback, any suggestions, any topics you want us covered. We will respond in detail to some more questions that you've posted to us today, and ones we couldn't maybe address sufficiently with who we had here with us today. And so we will come back to you with a little bit more. And meanwhile, yes, I wish you the best of luck on your journey, and we've got a number of more sessions planned over the next couple of months, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you. Bye.